Hey there, Broniacs. Welcome back to Bronze Over Brains. I'm your man, Bronson Layton, of course, and guys, it is great to see you. If you're watching this video, then by now, classes are finished for me this summer, and so now that I have a bit of time off from teaching, I thought I would do a few things like around the place, like straighten up and cook meals and whatnot. But at the same time, I've been thinking that while I do some chores, I thought I would catch up on some reading. And when the thought occurred to me to read, I thought, hey, why don't I go ahead and make a YouTube video explaining about who my favorite author is and what my 10 top favorite novels are from him. And that's precisely what we're going to be doing today. But before we officially get started with the video, if you're new here, welcome to Bronze Over Brains. I am so glad that you are joining me on my journey of being an autistic member of society and discovering and empowering his voice at the same time. If you're new here and you would like to view more content, please consider hitting that subscribe button and clicking the bell for notifications. We would very much love for you to be with us long term. So I hope you enjoy the video, and that goes for everyone else watching this video. And so without further ado, let's get down to the video. To begin this video, I am going to let you know who my favorite author is. Well, here it is. I am a die-hard Stephen King fan. Always have been and always will be. Now, I know there are some people out there who may not like his material because some of it may trigger some kind of morally questionable plots within the storylines. It depends on the reader. But in my case, I've always loved Stephen King's stories because the stories are like very suspenseful, and I'm a guy who likes to watch a lot of like cop movies and the thriller movies. I like to read detective stories, and of course that started from when I was younger. I've loved detective stuff since I watched Scooby-Doo as a little child, but it moved on from that. And then as I got older, I got into like horror-based stuff, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Chucky, if you've ever seen the Chucky movies, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees. All those are slasher movies, but the thing is, we're talking about Stephen King here, and he is predominantly known for his horror stories. And that's not the only thing he's famous for. He's also written fantasy and science fiction, and I'm going to say some mystery novels. And from what I know about Stephen King, he has published at least 50 or 60 novels in his lifetime, and he's still going at it today, which is very impressive. And so, yeah, I got into reading Stephen King's books when I was about 14 years old, about 11 years ago. And I really just thought that his material, it was like way out there and in an exciting way. But enough of me giving some background on my interest in his stories. I did mention that I have my top 10 favorite novels of his, and I have them right here with me today, so let's start the countdown. Okay, so my first Stephen King story that I would like to share with you is Misery. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this classic book. It's of course about a writer who gets caught in a car accident in the middle of a snowstorm and is getting taken care of by a nurse who was eventually shown some dark secrets. And by the way, I'm going to try to tell you about all these books without giving you heavy spoilers, so bear with me on this because I really want you guys to check out these books on your own if you're interested in reading any of Mr. King's material. And so anyway, I came across this this book probably when I was 14. It was one of the first ones I ever read. I got it at a Books A Million one time, and I thought, man, he's got a lot of stuff. And so little did I know at the time that a lot of Stephen King's books were adapted into feature films and television series, and I went crazy about that fact. And when I watched the movie on Misery, which had Kathy Bates in the role of Annie Wilkes, I was like really stunned by her performance. And whew, if you're familiar with the movie, you know what happens. But of course, the novel has some distinctions apart from the movie. The next book that I have of Stephen King's is another famous one called Cujo. If anyone's familiar with at least the name, Cujo is about a rabid dog who just goes berserk across a small town. And there was even a movie that was made off this. I believe it was in the 80s when it came out. And Cujo is one of Stephen King's earliest novels. Okay, for this third book that I'm going to show you, I'm going to geek out a little extra, okay, because I really love this book. This one is called The Long Walk. This is arguably one of my top favorites of Stephen King's, and I'll tell you why. Because this book is more of a dystopian tale rather than just mere suspense. It's got a fair amount of suspense in it, but it talks about a dystopian society in the future where 100 teenage boys walk a gruesome marathon across America until there was only one walker remaining. I will not tell you what happens to these walkers who tap out of the marathon. I'll leave you to figure that out for yourself. But what I find interesting about this book is that, to me, it's almost as if Stephen King was writing his own version of a Hunger Games kind of story way before its time. I know we all went crazy over the Hunger Games when it came out, but this book in particular depicts that kind of message about 20 or 30 years before Hunger Games was even thought of. Oh, and fun fact, a fun thing about this book is that if you look closely, Stephen King wrote this under the pen name Richard Bachman, and this was a pen name he had under a collection of certain stories that he wrote early on into his writing career. I haven't read many other stories when he had this pen name, but The Long Walk is where I have the exception of where I would make this my favorite out of that collection. And I also read that The Long Walk is technically the first story that Stephen King ever wrote. Not the first one ever published, but the first one he ever wrote. I read that he wrote this story when he was in college, sometime before he published his first novel, which was Carrie. Okay, so this next Stephen King book that I'm going to show you, it's a little heavy. It's called Sleeping Beauties. No, I am not referring to the Disney film Sleeping Beauty. This is something entirely different, even though the title is coincidentally similar. If you look closely, Stephen King wrote this with his son, Owen King, and this book in particular came out a little recently. It came out in 2017, 6 years ago, and look at how thick this book actually is, guys. Oh man, this is like an insane amount of pages for a book. I'm gonna be honest here. I am like halfway through this book. Even though I've had it a few years, it took me a very long time to get to the midpoint of this book, but it is so addictive. It's like actually reading a binge-worthy Netflix series. Seriously, it's got a lot of detective kind of fiction in it, but it also has its fair amount of suspense in it, and it has elements of supernatural themes in it. You really have to read it. It's insane. Long story short, it takes place in a women's prison somewhere in New England, and something happens to the women across the prison, and then eventually around the town that it's in, and I think it takes place around the world. And then the men in the community, they start to go crazy after not having female companionship. I'm a little rusty on my facts about this book because, like I said, it's been a while since I picked up where I left off on it, but I remember loving it so much, and I got to finish reading it, see what happens at the end. I did read that there's a possibility there may come a television series out of this, but whatever network picks up on it, that's beyond my knowledge. Okay, so this next Stephen King book, I don't really have much to share on it because I recently bought it. It's called Broniacs. From what I read about this book, I read it's a bit of a psychological kind of story. It's very interesting, but I really haven't read up much on the facts about what takes place in the book, but I picked it up because I got it for a cheap price somewhere, and I'm always up for trying something new. Let's see. After a terrible construction site accident severed his right arm, scrambled his mind, and imploded his marriage, the wealthy Minnesota builder faces the ordeal of rehabilitation alone and enraged. Renting a house on a stunningly beautiful and eerily undeveloped splinter off the Florida coast, Edgar slowly emerges from his prison of pain to bond with Elizabeth Eastlake, I believe that's what her last name is, a sick old woman whose roots are tangled deep in Broniacs. And as he heals, he paints, feverishly, compulsively, his exploding talent both a wonder and a weapon. For Edgar's creations are not just paintings, but portals for the ghosts of Elizabeth's past, and their power cannot be controlled. I guess that gives some information away without heavy spoilers, but I think this will be an interesting read for all of us. The next Stephen King book I have right here is called The Bazaar of Bad Dreams. I think I got this for Christmas 4 years ago. It's not a novel, but it is a collection of short stories, and I've heard many great things about this short story collection. It's pretty good. From the first couple of stories I read in it so far, I really hadn't had a chance to read all of it quite yet. But like I said, with this being my summertime off from teaching, I think if I'm going to do some catch-up reading, this will be my go-to place. So I'm going to read up more on it, and hopefully if you are into a collection of short stories and if you like Stephen King, this would be an interesting treat as well. So the other Stephen King book I have right here is called If It Bleeds. Now, similar to The Bazaar of Bad Dreams, this is a collection and not a novel, but the difference is that this particular book contains a collection of novellas. I think about 4 of them. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, a novella or novella, it is considerably longer than a short story, but not as long as a novel. Debatably, a novella could be 100 to 200 pages, in that range. Depends on who you ask. I think that novellas are more dependent on word count than page numbers, but like I said, it depends on who you would ask, who is familiar in that kind of field. Anyway, this has a collection of 4 short novels. Call them novellas, though, officially. They're called Mr. Harrigan's Phone, The Life of Chuck, If It Bleeds, and Rat. I haven't gotten past Mr. Harrigan's Phone yet, so I need to finish reading up on this as well. And by the way, this book is like very recent. It was published in 2020, 3 years after Sleeping Beauties. And so, yeah, I also got this book for Christmas about 2 years ago. So that would explain why I'm still fresh into finishing this particular book. Oh, and fun fact, the short story I mentioned that's in this book, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, I believe Netflix recently released a film adaptation of that novella. So I, for one, want to check it out, and I really can't wait. Now that it crossed my mind, I remember seeing the trailer on it. So the next 3 books that I'm going to discuss, I don't actually have them here with me. I left them at my old home back in Alabama, but I will discuss them with you nonetheless. I believe the next story that Stephen King wrote that's one of my top favorites, yeah, it's a book called Cell. It's a post-apocalyptic book that takes place in New England, I believe around Boston. It's about just about anyone who holds a cell phone goes like very crazy, turns into like wild animal kind of people. They don't literally turn into animals, but they turn into like feral human beings, as if they've been living in the wild or something. And it's about this New England man who bonds with other survivors who hadn't fallen victim to a cell phone phenomena known as the pulse, the thing that turns people into crazies. And they try to find this man's son as they travel along New England in the new post-apocalyptic world, and chaos unfolds around them. That's got to be one of my top favorites as well, along with The Long Walk, because for one, I love post-apocalyptic stuff like The Walking Dead, and so if I can imagine reading a book that is even remotely based on the possibility of falling civilization and whatnot, I'm just along for the ride. Okay, so my second to last Stephen King book that I'm going to talk about is The Shining. I believe that could have been the second or third book Stephen King ever published, but that's just my best guess. And anyway, if anyone is familiar with the famous Stanley Kubrick film, which Stephen King, I heard, did not like, by the way, yeah, that is what the book is. That movie was loosely based on Stephen King's story. And if you're not familiar with it, long story short, it's about a family who lives in a hotel for the winter in the Rocky Mountains, I believe. And the father, who's the winter caretaker, he seems to slowly build up a sense of cabin fever, and the hotel's ghostly inhabitants try to convince him to kill his wife and son, even though he tries to fight for his sanity to not do so. I've read the book. I still have it, but I don't have like a hardcover version of the book. I actually read The Shining on a Kindle several years back, so technically speaking, I still have it. And the last Stephen King book that I'll talk about is actually the long-awaited sequel to The Shining. It's called Dr. Sleep. Dr. Sleep was published about 10 years ago in 2013. I remember getting on Wikipedia all the time, reading about when the potential release date for Dr. Sleep would be. I waited months to maybe even a year or two to when I found out when that book was going to be released. One day I was just casually walking in Walmart and I found Dr. Sleep just there on the shelf, and I immediately bought it, and it took me 2 weeks, but I read the whole thing cover to cover. As a matter of fact, I read it at least twice for as long as I've had it. It's a very good book. I did say that it's the long-awaited sequel to The Shining because I think there's like a 30 or 40 year gap between the publication dates of both books. And there was a film adaptation for Dr. Sleep as well. It came out a few years ago, I think 2019, but I did buy the DVD on it and I enjoyed it. It was a great callback to both the Shining novel and the Stanley Kubrick film adaptation. You would just have to read the novels and see the movies to connect the dots on what I'm saying. Those are my top 10 Stephen King stories. And like I said, Broniacs, I wanted to make this video and share with you about who my favorite author is and what my 10 top books of his are to me. And me being an English major and an English instructor, you better believe that, yes, I do love to read. And if anybody comes at me with a Stephen King book, I'm going to be like, oh, you shouldn't have. And yeah, like I'm that huge of a fan. And I'm just glad I took the time today to talk to you about the collection I have of his books, which, by the way, it's a good thing I wore my my literature shirt from grad school in this video, even though you couldn't see what it said on it for most of the video. And so yeah, I'm gonna close the video here with the hopes that I hope you enjoyed this video. And again, if you want to see more content, please subscribe to Bronze Over Brains. I would love to have you along for the journey as I continue to publish more videos. By the way, I hope you Broniacs have a great summer. And until next time, this is Bronze Over Brains. I'm Bronson Layton, always reminding you to stay brawny. See you later, guys.